Before anyone called it the Philippines, it already had a name for itself. Well, sort of. See, there were over 7,000 islands scattered across the Western Pacific. Over 175 different ethnic groups. Dozens of languages. And for thousands of years, there was not a single ruler or flag, or even a simple word that tied all of it together. It was just small coastal communities called barangays, and each one was led by a datu, or chieftain. Each one was already trading rice and gold and spices with merchants from China, India, and Arabia. In fact, some ancient maps called these the Islands of Gold. So it's safe to say that this country was very much alive way before the Europeans arrived, which happened in 1521. Cue the story. A Portuguese explorer named Ferdinand Magellan was sailing under the Spanish crown. He was on a mission to find a westward route to the Spice Islands, but he lands in the Visayan region instead. He didn't come alone though. He arrived with priests, soldiers, and ambitions that went far beyond spices. So within weeks, he was already converting local chieftains to Christianity. But one stubborn datu refused. His name was Lapu Lapu, and on the island of Mactan, he did more than refuse the conversion. He defended his land and killed Magellan, though one death was not the end of Spain. After Magellan's crew limped back to Europe, Spain kept sending expeditions. By 1542, a commander named Ruy López de Villalobos arrived and named the islands Las Islas Filipinas, after Prince Philip, who was then heir to the Spanish throne. Imagine that, a country named after a king who had never set, and would never set, foot there. By 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi arrived, but he wanted to do less confrontation and more negotiation. At least that was the initial plan. That's when he established Manila as the colonial capital, built alliances with local datus, and began the slow, grinding work of bringing over 7,000 islands under one government. At the same time, Catholic missionaries fanned out across the archipelago in what the Spanish called conquista espiritual. Translation: spiritual conquest. The mission was pretty straightforward: convert the locals, relocate them into centralized towns, and tax them. Picture that, the same process over and over for 333 years. At some point, people had to have responded, right? Yup, they did, but let's just say it wasn't a peaceful conversation. For over 3 centuries, the Filipinos revolted constantly, not only against the conversion, but everything else in between. Like forced labour, or the encomienda system that basically turned their land into private estates for Spanish favourites, or the friars who accumulated more power than any elected official. But here's the funny thing. Remember when I said that the Philippines was made up of over 7,000 islands? Well, turns out it was too much for the Spanish to handle, because they never fully controlled the south, where Islam had arrived 2 centuries before Christianity. By the 1870s, the Filipinos were getting smarter, sharper. That's when a new Filipino intellectual class emerged. They were called the Ilustrados, the enlightened ones. They were made up of the sons of the emerging mestizo elite, educated in Manila and Europe. Because of that, they started writing, arguing, demanding equality as a form of revolt. Among the Ilustrados, there was a man named José Rizal. He wrote 2 novels, titled Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, that spread like fire through the islands. So the books, they were like a massive call-out post in novel form. Noli exposed the cancer of colonial society, the greedy friars and the corrupt government. El Fili was much darker. It was about a man coming back for revenge and starting a revolution. They were mirrors that showed Filipinos exactly how they were being mistreated. And when Spain got hold of this so-called propaganda, they weren't happy. They arrested Rizal and executed him on December 30th, 1896, hoping that killing him would quiet the murmurs. But it did the complete opposite, and within months, a full-scale revolution broke out. Under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, the Filipino forces had Spain on the ropes by 1898. And just when we thought the story was over, a ship exploded in Havana Harbour. The USS Maine, an American battleship, blew up under disputed circumstances. And the United States, who wanted to expand its sphere of influence, actually found the perfect stepping stone in the Philippines. Thus began the Spanish-American War. After 4 months, they decided on a peace settlement called it the Treaty of Paris. And part of that settlement meant that Spain would hand the Philippines over to the US for $20 million. At the time, I'm sure that was a lot of money. So, thinking that the Filipinos were finally free of Spanish rule, Aguinaldo declared independence on June 12, 1898. But he jumped the gun, because what followed was the Philippine-American War. It started when an American sentry shot a Filipino soldier in Manila, sparking a massive conflict. That's when the Filipinos realized they hadn't been liberated. They'd basically been sold to a new boss. By 1901, Aguinaldo was captured, and the Americans stayed for another 4 decades, building schools and roads with one hand, and suppressing resistance with the other. When Japan invaded in December 1941, the Americans retreated. That's when we hear MacArthur's famous words, "I shall return," before he evacuated to Australia, leaving Filipino and American soldiers to face the Bataan Death March, which was a 65-mile forced march of 76,000 prisoners of war in the sweltering heat. No food, no water. If you stumbled, you were bayoneted or shot. Thousands died before they even reached the prison camps. To this day, it still remains one of the most horrific war crimes in Pacific history. Going back, Japan continued to occupy the islands for 3 years. But true to his word, MacArthur did return in 1944, and by 1945, the Philippines was finally free. At an enormous cost. See, Manila was the second most devastated city of World War II, right after Warsaw. On the bright side though, on July 4th, 1946, the Republic of the Philippines was officially recognised. Wait, hold the applause everyone, because in 1965, Ferdinand Marcos won the presidency. He was promising, very charismatic, quite ambitious. But in 1972, he declared martial law and became a dictator. It was a dark time for the country. Imagine waking up to find the TV and radio silent. No news except what the government allowed. Thousands of students, writers, and activists, quote-unquote, disappeared, never seen again. All the while, the first family lived in unbelievable luxury. Literally thousands of pairs of designer shoes and Swiss bank accounts. And the average Filipino? Well, they faced curfews, checkpoints, and a military that answered only to one man. It was like that for a while, until opposition leader Benigno Ninoy Aquino was assassinated at Manila Airport in 1983. He was shot the moment he stepped off the plane. That was the wake-up call the country needed. Because 3 years later, in 1986, a mass uprising called People Power, or EDSA Revolution, forced Marcos and his wife, Imelda, into exile in Hawaii. Corazon Correa Aquino, Ninoy's widow, became the president. It was a turning point for sure, but I'm not saying the decades after were smooth sailing. On the contrary, it was full of corruption scandals, impeachment trials, drug wars, and so much more. Then, a plot twist. In 2022, the son of Ferdinand Marcos, Bongbong Marcos, won the presidency. Who saw that one coming? Not me. But I do know one thing. Despite all the twists and turns in Philippines history, one thing stayed true. There's nothing else on earth quite like it. And I'll tell you why. The Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,641 islands stretched across the Western Pacific, though only around 2,000 of those islands are actually inhabited, which are then split into 3 main groups. You've got Luzon in the north. It's the biggest island and home to Manila, the country's capital. Then there's Visayas in the middle, which is where island hopping dreams come true and where most of the tourism lives. And down south is Mindanao. It's largely rural, incredibly agricultural, and culturally distinct from all the rest. Within those larger islands are mountains like Mount Apo, which peaks at nearly 3,000 metres, or about 9,692 feet. There are also rivers that cut through lush valleys and rolling hills that drop into coastal plains. Then there are the volcanoes. Some of them are dormant, but a lot are still very much awake. In fact, in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted in what was the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. It was so massive that it actually lowered global temperatures by about 0.5 degrees Celsius, or 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit for a whole year, and permanently reshaped the northern landscape of Luzon. And honestly, that makes sense because the Philippines sits right on the Pacific Ring of Fire. So natural calamities like that, plus about 20 typhoons a year, are just part of the rhythm of life here. Luckily, that doesn't deter people from booking flights, because let me tell you, the Philippines is a world-class tourist destination. And I mean, if you want, you can see it too. Just click the link in the description to get amazing flight and accommodation deals. Because trust me, you wouldn't want to miss those clear blue waters. In fact, the Philippines is surrounded by 4 major bodies of water: the Philippine Sea to the east, the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea to the west, and the Sulu and Celebes Seas to the south. With that alone, you can just imagine how biodiverse the coral reefs are around here. For instance, the Verde Island Passage has been called the centre of marine shorefish biodiversity. Then there's Apo Reef, the second largest contiguous coral reef in the world, and Apo Island, that famous 74-hectare sanctuary off Negros. Both of them draw divers and marine biologists from all over the planet to witness sharks, rays, sea turtles, and hundreds of fish species in their own habitat. And if that doesn't convince you to book that flight, maybe this will. Scientists have actually called the Philippines the Galapagos times 10. So let that be your sign. But I don't want you going in blind, which is why I'm giving you the full picture. Yes, I'm talking about the economy. See, the Philippines has survived colonizers, world wars, a dictator, and multiple natural disasters. So it's only natural to ask, how's the economy doing? Honestly, it depends on who you ask and when. But here's the baseline. The Philippines has a population of over 114 million people, making it one of the largest and most dynamic economies in Southeast Asia. It's also been growing consistently for years, so much so that it was on track to hit upper middle income status by 2026. Yes, the middle class is expanding. Infrastructure is being built under the Build Better More program, and foreign investment has been flowing in. But 2025 and 2026 hit differently. First, a massive flood control corruption scandal surfaced in late 2025. It exposed how a small group of about 15 contractors cornered roughly 18% to 20% of a 545 billion peso public works budget. We're talking about allegations of ghost projects and massive kickbacks. As a result, the government had to tighten the belt, spending slowed down, and consumer confidence took a major hit. On top of that, GDP growth in the last quarter of 2025 dropped to 3%, the weakest it's been since the pandemic recovery. Then, just as the economy was trying to find its footing in early 2026, the Middle East conflict escalated, causing global oil prices to spike. And while that price surge affects everyone, it's a specific nightmare for the Philippines because the country imports almost all of its fuel. Meaning higher prices don't just mean more expensive gas. On a larger scale, they mean higher food prices, higher transport costs, and a weaker peso. On that note, the peso has been under intense pressure, and inflation climbed back up to 4.1% in March 2026. The IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB all had to trim their growth forecasts within weeks of each other. So, depending on which report you read, GDP growth for 2026 is now expected to be around 4.4% to 5.3%. Despite all that, the Philippines still projects the second highest growth rate in ASEAN for 2026, sitting right behind Vietnam. Plus, the domestic economy still has real momentum, from having a young English proficient population and one of the highest literacy rates in Asia, to a booming services sector and a government pushing for massive public-private partnerships. It's got the winning formula. The challenge now is turning that potential into a reality. And perhaps this can shed light on just how they can do that. Because after everything it's been through, the country's not bitter at all. Quite the opposite, actually. It's loud and colourful. Plus, it throws tons of festivals or fiestas all year round. At the centre of that? No, it's not the government or the church, or any colonial structure. It's the family. From that foundation comes the concept of bayanihan. That's the old tradition of neighbours literally lifting a bahay kubo, aka a bamboo house, together and carrying it to a new location. Of course, that was then. Now it's evolved into something even more powerful. You see it in their disaster response, in community pantries during tough times, and in the way over 10 million Filipinos live and work abroad. These modern-day heroes sent home a record, breaking $35.6 billion in 2025, and the 2026 numbers are already on track to beat that. They do these things because that's what you do for your people, which honestly stems from two deep-rooted concepts. First, utang na loob. It translates to a debt of the soul, or a debt of gratitude. It's the idea that when someone helps you in your darkest hour, that act of kindness is never forgotten, essentially creating a lifelong bond. Second, pakikisama. It's about social harmony. It means being one with the group, adjusting your own needs to get along with others, and making sure no one is left behind, even when things are uncomfortable. And this brings us straight back to the beginning, where this story started. Before Magellan, before 3 centuries with Spain or the decades of American rule, there were small communities of people who organised their lives around each other. They moved together, fought together, and looked out for each other. And in this time of economic shifts and global tensions, isn't that exactly what a nation needs to prosper? Yeah, so let me know down in the comments what you think of the Philippines roller coaster story. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.